report on New York State's education out this week called for changes in the way the state supports public schools. Excuse me. It recommended changes in so-called foundation aid, including ending the Save Harmless provision, which ensures no district gets less state aid than it did the previous year. The report's recommendations are getting mixed reviews in Albany. Even the governor is now saying she doesn't want cuts after she wanted the recommendations. So should there be these changes, and should the Save Harmless provision be maintained or changed?
I think it should be maintained. First of all, foundation aid is a huge mess. God bless the Rockefeller Institute for issuing the report and coming up with a flow chart to try to explain how foundation aid works. If you take a look at that flow chart, it does not make any sense.
And
There's
we
multiple
have it up
moving
on the screen
pieces.
right now.
Yes, multiple moving pieces and fractions and all kinds of stuff. And as someone who served on the school board for many years, I asked repeatedly, can somebody please explain to me how foundation aid works? And I never got a satisfactory
I was hoping you could explain it.
No. In terms of the Safe Harmless piece, here's the thing. School districts operate like nonprofit businesses, right? So another question I had as a school board member is, why do we have to keep raising taxes every year? And the reason is because the cost to provide the same services goes up. There are fixed costs in school districts: energy, health insurance, contractual salary obligations, right? So to do the same thing every year, you have to have more money or you have to cut services. And that's a really difficult position for school districts to be in. So if you're going to remove the if you're going to lower the floor for some districts with state aid, that's going to be a problem because they're not going to be able to raise more taxes unless they can get a supermajority and go to their constituents to do that because of the tax cap system. And it's going to mean that services are going to be cut just to maintain the status quo. Now, concerns are raised about equity, but the vast majority of state aid go to lower income school districts, right? Particularly in our region, for instance. Syracuse school districts got about nearly $500 million in state aid. It's about 80% of their operating budget. The other surrounding towns, it's flipped. Their operating budgets are predominantly coming from from local taxes, right? And state aid is 5%, 10%, 15% of their local budget.
Yeah, I appreciate that Luke talked about the much broader scheme of school funding. This particular piece that we're talking about, foundation aid, came about as a result of a lawsuit that was filed in 2007 to push for equity and funding of schools. And so this is to sort of provide more balance between the funding for lower income schools and upper income schools. And part of the problem is that it doesn't take into account school poverty, student poverty, that is, in the way that it should. It doesn't take into account the number of students who are homeless and all of the other kinds of issues that less well-to-do schools have to deal with. But I will say this, that it seems the debate about this has centered largely around New York City. In fact, if you look at the funding of the $25 billion, roughly $9 billion goes to New York City alone. And yet upstate schools have a whole slew of other problems that converge on schools, including the fentanyl crisis, the limited access to internet services, and also health care. So if you're going to talk about homelessness for New York City, let's talk about all of these other issues for upstate schools.
Lisa?
Well, I have a question. I guess I'm pleased to hear that someone who actually knows way more about this than I do, and both of you, it sounds like, agree. My reaction was, like everything else in New York government, this is incredibly complicated, like ridiculously complicated. So I'm glad to hear that's been reaffirmed. But my question is, what about the 1/3 of school districts in the state that have excesses, that above what they're allowed to hold under state law every year?
That shouldn't happen. So the comptroller does accounting on that, and they should go below the 4% threshold. So there's a cap of how much you can put in reserve funds,
reserves,
essentially,
right.
and it's 4% of your budget. So that should be enforced, no doubt. But the idea that school districts shouldn't have those reserves, I disagree with. Why do you have these reserves? Because it helps you manage your money better. For instance, school buses are expensive. If you wait till a school bus blows out, it's $80,000 to $100,000 that you have to spend. If you're buying that just like we would buy a car and you get a loan, you're going to have to pay the cost of it and the interest. You can use instead your reserve funding to come up with a plan like we did in my district to rotate your school buses on a system, use the reserve funding to pay cash to get the school buses, and then you save money, and that's good for, and I didn't come up with that. That was Joe Barrett, who's one of the best in the business. Right?
I'm voting for Luke.
Amen.
So Tyra, but this idea of the reserve money, I mean, you make a good point, Lisa, that if you have in excess of that reserve, should that come out of then the basic floor of the Save Harmless provision?
I think it should, because, you know, it's very clear how much you can put in reserves. And so once you reach that ceiling, then automatically I think that should go back into a general fund that is then equitably, if you can figure out the funding system, equitably distributed to schools that don't have that cap. And it sounds like the original intent was that this would be revisited every year. So, you know, maybe this year you have above that 4%, next year you don't, so you're not losing any money. And so I really do think it should go back into a general fund where that is then equitably distributed, as long as every year that is again being revisited.
And furthermore, I agree. And furthermore, my problem with, you know, your argument is that it just increases. The budgets just go up.
Right, and if you have reserve funds, to me that means you didn't need those funds, that they were not expended.
I mean, it's just sensible.
And so for districts that ran a deficit, why not reallocate them appropriately?
And one of the interesting things and pretty mind-boggling things is a lot of this is based on data that's 25 years
Right.
old. You mentioned
Exactly.
poverty. We're talking about the 2000 census.
2000, exactly.
That's nuts, if I may say so.